What did people eat 700 years ago? Most of us picture mud-caked peasants chewing on stale bread and thin, watery soup. Or maybe we imagine kings tearing into giant turkey legs at a banquet. The truth is stranger, and a lot more delicious. They ate flowers. They made candy from ginger and sugar. Their pies were filled with live birds. They dyed their food bright yellow with saffron and deep purple with exotic flowers. Sugar was a spice used on fish and meat. And they loved sour flavors, using a sour grape juice called verjuice in almost everything. Their food wasn't just about survival. It was about status, medicine, and art. But we've forgotten these dishes. We see the Middle Ages as a dark, grim period. We assume their food was just as bad. What if it wasn't? What if their kitchens produce flavors that are complex, surprising, and genuinely good? We're going to look at some of these lost recipes. Not just the weird ones, but the ones that might deserve a place on our own tables. We'll rebuild them, taste them, and ask a simple question. Was medieval food actually great? Number 25. Could a bowl of mush be comfort food? Let's start with the most basic food imaginable. It's pottage. This was the foundation of the medieval diet for rich and poor alike. The word itself just means pottage, or something cooked in a pot. It could be anything from a thin, grainy gruel to a thick, rich stew. For a peasant, it was often the only meal of the day. The peasant version was simple. It was made with whatever was available. Oats or barley, maybe some peas or beans for protein. They'd throw in onions, leeks, and cabbage from their small garden plot, what was called a wort yard. If they were lucky, a bit of bacon fat would add flavor. This pot would simmer over the hearth all day. People would eat from it, add more water, add more vegetables, and keep it going for days. The chronicler Piers Plowman, writing in the late 14th century, gives us a glimpse into the peasant diet. He speaks of a few curds and cream and a loaf of beans and bran. It was about survival. But the pottage of a wealthy household was a different thing entirely. The cooks in a castle kitchen had access to better ingredients. Their pottage, what they might call a brouette or a civet, would be thick with meat or fish. They used chicken, pork, or rabbit, often shredded or ground into a paste. They added expensive imported spices like black pepper, cloves, and mace. Almond milk, made by steeping ground almonds in water, was a common ingredient to make it creamy, especially during Lent when dairy was forbidden. One recipe, called frumenty, was a pottage for special occasions. It appears in one of the oldest English cookbooks, the Form of Curie, compiled around 1390 for the master cooks of King Richard II. The recipe calls for whole wheat cracked and boiled until soft, then it's mixed with rich beef or venison broth and almond milk. They added saffron to make it a brilliant yellow and sometimes egg yolks to make it richer. It was served as a side dish with meat. It was thick, creamy, and savory. Think of it as a medieval version of risotto or a very luxurious porridge. It was true comfort food, a warm, filling dish that showed off the host's wealth through its ingredients. So, how do you make a basic, good pottage today? It's simple. Start with some stock, chicken, or vegetable. Add some pearl barley, let it simmer, chop up some leeks, onions, and carrots. Add those to the pot. If you have some leftover cooked chicken or pork, shred it and stir it in. Season it with a little salt and black pepper. Let it cook until the barley is soft and the stew is thick. It's not fancy, but it's deeply satisfying. It connects you to a fundamental taste of the past. But this simplicity hides so many questions. We have the recipes, but so much is missing. When a recipe said to cook something until it was enough, what did that mean? How did they control the heat on an open fire to simmer a pottage for hours without burning it? And for the peasant pottage that was kept going for days, how did they stop it from going bad or becoming a breeding ground for disease? What did the ever-changing flavor of a days-old pottage really taste like? Number 24, were vegetables just weeds? We have this idea that medieval people, especially the English, only ate meat. Vegetables were seen as lowly peasant food. This isn't entirely true. While the nobility prized meat, vegetables known as worts or herbs were a huge part of the diet for everyone. The difference was in how they were prepared. A peasant would eat his worts raw or boiled in the pottage pot. A lord, however, would eat his vegetables processed into something more refined. One of the most common and surprisingly tasty dishes was called buttered worts. It sounds plain, but it was a simple and effective way to make greens delicious. The recipe is found in several 15th century English manuscripts. The instructions were straightforward. Take good herbs like cabbage, spinach, or beet greens, pick them over, wash them, and parboil them in water. Then, squeeze out all the water. This was a crucial step. Medieval cooks believed that raw or improperly cooked vegetables could cause wind and unbalance the body's humors, a medical theory dating back to the ancient Greeks. Squeezing the water out was thought to make them safer to eat. After squeezing, you chop the greens finely. Then comes the good part. You put the chopped greens in a clean pot with good, sweet butter. You also add a little bit of clear water or broth. You season it with salt and maybe a pinch of saffron for color. And then you heat it, stirring until the butter is melted and everything is hot. It was served warm as a side dish. What does it taste like? It's rich, savory, and surprisingly modern. The greens are tender, and the butter adds a wonderful flavor and richness. It's not far from creamed spinach, just without the cream. Making it today is easy. Take a bunch of kale or chard, boil it for a few minutes, drain it, and chop it fine. Melt a good knob of butter in a pan, add the greens, a splash of stock, and a pinch of salt. It's a perfect side for roast chicken or fish. This dish tells us a lot. It shows that they cared about the texture and preparation of vegetables. It wasn't just about boiling them to mush. The act of parboiling, squeezing, and then reheating in butter is a proper cooking technique. Food historian Bridget Ann Hennish, in her book Fast and Feast, explains that medieval cooks were masters of transforming ingredients. They didn't like things in their natural state. Everything had to be chopped, ground, spiced, and colored. Buttered worts is a simple example of this principle. The greens are transformed from a simple plant into a proper dish. But there are gaps in our knowledge. What exactly were the good herbs they used? The recipes are often vague. They likely used a mix of cultivated plants like cabbage and wild greens foraged from the fields, things we'd call weeds today, like fat hen or good King Henry. Did every household have its own unique blend of worts? And when they used butter, was it salted or unsalted? The quality and taste of butter would have varied wildly by region and season. How much did the taste of the local pasture affect the final dish? Number 23, could you get a cavity in the Middle Ages? Yes, absolutely. And one of the culprits was a confection called payn ragoun. The name sounds fancy, but the recipe is simple. It was a type of ginger candy, and it shows the medieval elite's love for sugar and spice. Sugar was a new and incredibly expensive ingredient in medieval Europe. It was first brought back in quantity by crusaders returning from the Holy Land around the 11th century. It was grown in places like Cyprus and Sicily. It was sold in solid cones called loaves and was treated like a precious spice, locked away with pepper and saffron. For a long time, it was considered a medicine, prescribed by doctors to balance the body's humors. But soon enough, its power as a sweetener and preservative was recognized. Payn ragoun, which means sweet bread of raisin or something similar, appears in the form of curry. The recipe calls for 2 simple ingredients, honey and clarified sugar, and 1 main flavoring, powdered ginger. Sometimes other spices like cinnamon or cloves were added. To make it, you combine the honey and sugar in a pot and boil them. You had to stir it constantly. This was a dangerous job for a kitchen boy, as boiling sugar can cause terrible burns. You'd cook it until it reached a certain consistency. The recipe says to test it by dropping a bit into cold water. If it turned hard, it was ready. This is basically the hard crack stage in modern candy making, around 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it was ready, you'd stir in a large amount of powdered ginger. Then you poured the mixture onto a greased slab to cool. Before it set completely, you would score it into small diamond shapes. The result was a hard, brittle candy. It would have been intensely sweet from the honey and sugar, with a powerful warming kick from the ginger. This wasn't a dessert in our sense. It was often served at the end of a feast as a subtlety, or as a digestive aid. Ginger was thought to help settle the stomach after a heavy meal. So, while it was a treat, it was also considered functional food. The existence of recipes like this shatters the myth of a sugarless medieval world. The wealthy had a serious sweet tooth. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in the teeth of high-status individuals from the period. Skeletons from noble cemeteries show a much higher rate of tooth decay than those from peasant graveyards. For example, analysis of remains from the medieval Gilbertine Priory in York, England, showed that the monks who had access to sugar had significantly worse dental health than the general population. But the recipe leaves us wondering, how did they achieve a consistent temperature without a thermometer? Was the success of a batch of payn ragoun down to the pure instinct and experience of the cook? The recipe calls for powdered ginger. Was this ginger ground fresh in the kitchen, or did they buy it pre-ground? The freshness and potency would have dramatically changed the final flavor. And was this candy purely for the rich, or did a simpler honey-only version exist for common folk on special occasions? Number 22, did they drink their dinner? Sometimes, yes, especially if they were sick, old, or a new mother. The dish was called a caudle, and it sat somewhere between a drink, a soup, and a porridge. It was a warm, spiced, and fortified drink designed to be comforting and restorative. A caudle was a staple of medieval and early modern medicine. The idea behind it was based on humoral theory. Sickness was seen as an imbalance of the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. The food was the primary way to restore that balance. A caudle, being warm and spiced, was considered a hot and moist food. It was perfect for treating ailments caused by an excess of cold and dry, like a common cold or melancholy. It was also given to women after childbirth to help them regain their strength. The recipes for caudles vary, but the base was usually ale or wine. This was thickened with egg yolks and sometimes breadcrumbs or ground almonds. It was sweetened with sugar or honey and spiced heavily. Common spices included ginger, cloves, mace, and saffron, which gave it a cheerful yellow color. A typical recipe found in many household manuscripts from the 15th century onwards would go like this. You take a quart of good ale, you set it on the fire to warm. In a separate bowl, you beat the yolks of several eggs. You mix the beaten eggs with a little of the warm ale, then slowly pour that mixture back into the main pot, stirring constantly so the eggs don't scramble. You add sugar, ginger, and saffron. You let it heat through gently, but you don't let it boil. You serve it hot in a cup or bowl. The taste is unusual to a modern palate, right? It's like a warm, spiced, alcoholic eggnog or a thin, sweet custard. The ale gives it a slightly bitter, malty background, which is balanced by the sweetness of the sugar and the warmth of the spices. It's surprisingly comforting. It's easy to see why it was considered a food for convalescents. It's easy to digest and full of energy from the eggs and sugar. The famous medieval mystic and abbess, Hildegard of Bingen, who lived in the 12th century, wrote extensively about the healing properties of food and spices. While she didn't write a specific caudle recipe, her work, like Physica, laid the groundwork for this kind of food-based medicine. She championed spices like ginger and galangal for their warming properties, exactly the kind of ingredients used in a caudle. Making a simple version today is straightforward. Warm some beer or white wine. Whisk some egg yolks with sugar and a pinch of cinnamon and nutmeg. Temper the eggs with the warm liquid, then combine and heat gently until it thickens slightly. It's a taste of history's medicine cabinet. But what did good ale actually mean in the 15th century? Was it strong, weak, hopped, or unhopped? The type of ale would completely change the flavor of the caudle. And when a recipe calls for spices, was there a standard mix, or did each cook have their own secret blend? More importantly, did these caudles actually work? Was there any real medicinal benefit beyond providing calories and comfort, or was it purely a placebo based on the science of the day? Number 21. Could a roast be deceptive? In medieval cooking, things were rarely what they seemed. A swan might be put back in its feathers after roasting. A pie might have live frogs jump out when cut, and a piece of roast pork could be disguised as something else entirely. This dish was called cormarye. Cormarye was a specific preparation for pork, usually a loin. The name might come from coriander, one of its key spices, or it might be related to a French style of preparation. The recipe is found in the 14th century English collection, The Form of Cury. It's a great example of the medieval love for sweet, sour, and heavily spiced flavors, especially with meat. The process starts with a loin of pork. First, you parboil it. This was a common medieval technique to clean the meat and start the cooking process. After parboiling, you let it cool, then you score the skin in a checkerboard pattern. This is a key step, similar to how we score pork belly today, to get crispy crackling. Next, you make a powerful seasoning paste. The recipe calls for coriander seed and caraway seed ground into a powder. You mix this with pepper and garlic. Then you add powder douce, a sweet spice mix that likely contains sugar, cinnamon, and cloves. You also add salt. You rub this spice mixture all over the pork loin, pushing it into the scored cuts. And then you roast it. The recipe doesn't specify how, but it would have been on a spit over an open fire. While it roasts, you baste it with a special glaze. This glaze is made from wine and galantine, a sauce made with breadcrumbs, vinegar, and spices like galangal, a root similar to ginger and cinnamon. This basting process would build up a dark, glossy, and intensely flavorful crust on the meat. The final dish would have looked almost black from the glaze and spices. When you cut into it, you'd find moist, tender pork. The flavor would be an explosion. It's savory from the pork, aromatic from the coriander and caraway, hot from the pepper, sweet from the sugar and the spice mix, and sour from the vinegar and the glaze. It's a complex and balanced dish. It is definitely not bland. Why go to all this trouble? It was about showing off. According to food historian Terence Scully, author of The Art of Cookery in the Middle Ages, this kind of heavy spicing and coloring was a mark of wealth and sophistication. Spices were expensive. Using a lot of them showed you could afford it. Disguising the food, making a simple piece of pork look like something more exotic and mysterious, was part of the theater of the medieval feast. But how did they control the roasting process on a spit to cook the pork through without burning a sugar-based glaze to a bitter crisp? The recipe calls for galangal. How different was the flavor of medieval galangal compared to what we can buy today? And what was the exact composition of powder douce? Was it a standard commercial mix, or was it a unique blend for King Richard II's kitchen? Its true recipe now lost forever. Number 20. How do you make fish taste less fishy? Before the medieval Christian, life was governed by the church calendar, and the calendar was full of fast days. Every Friday, all of Lent, and various other vigils and holy days were meatless. For a wealthy household, this didn't mean eating bread and water, it meant eating fish. Like lots and lots of fish. But fresh fish was not always available, especially inland. So they relied on preserved fish, salted, pickled, or dried cod, stockfish, and salted herring. The challenge for a medieval cook was to make this often bland and very fishy tasting food exciting. One solution was a sauce called sauce soil. It appears in 15th century manuscripts and was designed to be served with roasted or boiled fish. The name might mean a sauce that soils or darkens the fish, or it could be a corruption of a French word. It's a simple sauce, but it uses powerful flavors to mask and complement the fish. The recipe is straightforward. You take onions and mince them very finely, then you boil them in a small amount of water until they are very soft. After boiling, you drain them and put them in a mortar. You add breadcrumbs which have been soaked in vinegar. You grind these together into a smooth paste. To this paste, you add powdered pepper, ginger, and cinnamon. Finally, you thin the sauce to the right consistency with more vinegar and a little salt. You would pour this sauce over a piece of boiled tench or roasted pike. The result is a sauce that is both sharp and spicy. The vinegar provides a strong acidic kick, which cuts through the oiliness of some fish. The onions, softened and ground, give it a savory background sweetness, and the spices pepper, ginger, and cinnamon add warmth and complexity. The use of cinnamon with fish is strange to us, but it was common in medieval cooking. They didn't have our rigid categories of sweet and savory spices. This sauce is a perfect example of what the great French chef Taivent, who wrote La Viandier around 1380, was trying to achieve. His cooking was about powerful, contrasting flavors. He used vinegar, verjuice, and spices to create dishes that were anything but subtle. Sauce soil follows this philosophy. It's not a delicate sauce, it's a bold statement designed to make a boring piece of Lenten fish palatable. Making it today is an interesting experiment. Finely chop an onion and boil it. Mash it with a piece of bread soaked in red wine vinegar. Add a pinch of black pepper, ground ginger, and cinnamon. It's a powerful condiment, a bit like a medieval chutney or relish. It works surprisingly well with a simple piece of grilled mackerel or cod. But the recipe leaves us wondering. It calls for vinegar. What kind of vinegar? Was it wine vinegar, ale vinegar, or cider vinegar? Each would give a different flavor. The recipe also relies on the cook's judgment. for the proportions. How much bread to how much onion? How much spice? Was a spicy sauce in one household considered mild in another? And did they ever use this sauce on anything other than fish? Could it have been a way to liven up leftover boiled meat on a non-fast day? Number 19, could a pie contain a whole garden? Medieval pies, or tarts, were very different from ours. Their crusts, called coffins, were often thick, straight-sided, and not meant to be eaten. They were simply edible containers for the filling. And the fillings could be incredibly complex, mixing sweet and savory, meat and fruit, in ways we find strange today. A great example of this is a tart of herbs. This recipe from the 15th century is essentially a quiche or a savory custard tart, but filled with a wide variety of herbs and flowers. It was a dish for the spring and summer, using the best of the kitchen garden. It shows that medieval cuisine was not all brown stews, it could be green, fresh, and vibrant. The recipe starts with the pastry case. It would be a simple short crust, made with flour, water, and lard or butter. The cook would form this into a deep shell. Then, you prepare the filling. The recipe says to take good herbs and parboil them, squeeze out the water, and chop them fine. This is the same technique as for buttered worts. The herbs used would be a mixed spinach, parsley, chard, and maybe some more unusual ones like borage or tansy. To the chopped herbs, you add cheese. The recipe specifies grated cheese, likely a hard aged cheese similar to cheddar or parmesan. You also add eggs beaten well. This mixture is seasoned with powdered douce, the sweet spice mix, and sometimes saffron for color. Some recipes also call for adding flowers like primrose or violet blossoms directly into the filling. The whole mixture is poured into the pastry shell and baked. The result is a deep, savory tart. It would taste rich and cheesy with the fresh green flavor of the herbs coming through. The spices would add a subtle sweetness and warmth. If flowers were used, they would add a delicate floral note and beautiful specks of color. It's a sophisticated and delicious dish, a celebration of the garden. This kind of dish reflects the importance of the garden in a medieval household. The monastery gardens in particular were centers of botanical knowledge. Monks following the rule of Saint Benedict were skilled gardeners growing not just food but also medicinal herbs. The great scholar Albertus Magnus, in the 13th century, wrote extensively on botany, and his work shows a deep understanding of plants. A tarte of herbs is a culinary expression of this botanical knowledge, but what was the exact mix of good herbs? The flavor could change dramatically depending on whether you use mild spinach or slightly bitter tansy. Some herbs they used, like cormarye or alicost, are hard to find today. What did they taste like? The recipe also mentions flowers. Were these just for color, or did they contribute a significant flavor? And how did they ensure the tart was cooked through in a wood-fired oven without the top burning before the custard in the middle was set? Number 18, what did they drink when water was unsafe? For most people in the Middle Ages, the everyday drink was small ale. It was a weak, low-alcohol beer that was cheap to make and safer to drink than water from a potentially contaminated well or river. But for a celebration or a wealthy table, they drank something much more special, spiced wine. One of the most famous of these was Hippocras. Hippocras was a hugely popular drink across Europe for centuries. It was named, supposedly, after the Greek physician Hippocrates because the wine was filtered through a cloth bag called a monicum hippocraticum, or sleeve of Hippocrates. It was essentially a mulled wine, but served cold or at room temperature, and it was intensely sweet and spicy. The recipe appears in countless manuscripts, including the Forme of Curie and Taillevent's Le Viandier. The base was red or white wine. To this you added a shocking amount of spices. The most important was cinnamon. A good Hippocras had to have a strong cinnamon flavor. Other key spices were ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, and galangal. Sometimes more exotic ingredients like grains of paradise, a peppery spice from West Africa, or spikenard were included. The spices were coarsely ground but not powdered. They were mixed with a large quantity of sugar. The sugar and spices were then stirred into the wine. The mixture was left to infuse for a period, sometimes overnight. Then came the crucial filtering step. The wine was poured repeatedly through the cloth sleeve, which was filled with the spices. This process clarified the wine and transferred the flavor of the spices. The first run-through would be the strongest and best, reserved for the Lord. Subsequent run-throughs with the same spices would produce a weaker version for the rest of the household. The taste of Hippocras is powerful. It's very sweet, with the sugar balancing the tannins in the red wine. Then you get a wave of warm spice, dominated by cinnamon and ginger. It was served at the end of a feast, much like a dessert wine or port today. It was also considered a health tonic, with the warm spices thought to aid digestion. The cost of the ingredients meant this was a luxury drink. A pound of cinnamon in 14th century London cost about the same as a skilled craftsman earned in 2 weeks. The spice trade, controlled for centuries by Venetian and Genoese merchants who bought spices in Alexandria and Constantinople, was a source of immense wealth and political power. Drinking Hippocras was a direct way of displaying your connection to this global trade and your immense wealth. But we have so many questions. The recipes just say wine, what kind, a strong Bordeaux, a light German wine. The base wine would completely alter the final product. And when they specified cinnamon, were they using the cassia bark we often use today, or true cinnamon from Ceylon, which has a more delicate flavor? How many times could they reuse the spices before the flavor was too weak? Was there a black market for spent Hippocras spices to be sold to the poor to make a pale imitation of the real thing? Number 17, how did you show off with the chicken? If you were a medieval lord, a simple roast chicken wasn't going to impress your guests. You needed something more spectacular. You needed a dish that was also a piece of theater. You needed a subtlety. One of the most famous and impressive was the gilded chicken. This wasn't a specific recipe, but a technique of presentation. It involved roasting a chicken or other bird. Peacocks and swans were favorites for this, and then, covering it with edible gold or a convincing yellow glaze to make it look like solid gold. It was the ultimate display of wealth and artistry in the kitchen. The process was complex. First, the chicken would be prepared for roasting. Sometimes it was stuffed with a mixture of herbs, breadcrumbs, and spices. It was then roasted carefully on a spit. The key was to cook it perfectly without breaking the skin. After roasting, it was allowed to cool slightly. Then came the gilding. The most lavish method was to use actual gold leaf. Gold leaf is pure, inert gold beaten into incredibly thin sheets. It's edible, though it has no flavor and passes through the body undigested. The cook would carefully apply the fragile sheets of gold leaf to the entire surface of the cooked bird. This was a painstaking process requiring great skill. The result was a stunning, glittering centerpiece for the feast table. A cheaper, more common method was to create a golden glaze. A recipe for this appears in a 15th century manuscript. It calls for making a batter of flour and saffron. You grind the saffron with a little water to release its intense yellow color, then mix it with flour to make a thin paste. You would paint this batter all over the chicken. Then, you would put the chicken back near the fire to set the glaze. Another method involved using a glaze made from egg yolks and saffron, which would give a beautiful, glossy, golden finish. This wasn't just about food, it was about power. At a feast described in 1465 to celebrate the installation of the Archbishop of York, the menu included partridges roasted and covered with gold leaf. Such a dish sent a clear message. Not only could the host afford to serve thousands of guests, but he could afford to serve them food that was literally covered in money. It was conspicuous consumption at its most extreme. Art historian Michael Camille has written about the medieval love of bright, glittering surfaces, seen in illuminated manuscripts and stained glass windows. Gilded food was a way of bringing that aesthetic to the dinner table. It turned the meal into a work of art. But how did they handle the delicate gold leaf in a hot, greasy kitchen environment without it tearing or sticking to everything? When using a saffron glaze, how did they get an even coating without it looking streaky or clumpy? And was the gilded bird actually eaten, or was it more of a table decoration with a more plainly cooked version being carved and served to the guests? What did the guests think when they first saw a bird of pure gold brought into the hall? Number 16, can a salad be a work of art? We think of salads as a modern health food, but medieval people ate them too. They weren't always made of lettuce, though. A medieval salad could be a collection of cooked or raw vegetables and herbs, often arranged in intricate patterns. They're about flavor, health, and beauty. A typical recipe for a salad appears in 15th century sources. It gives a long list of possible ingredients. For the base, you could use parsley, watercress, spinach, or sorrel. You would add thinly sliced onions and leeks. Then you would add a variety of herbs for flavor: sage, mint, rosemary, and dittany. The most interesting part was the addition of flowers. The recipe suggests borage flowers, marigolds, primroses, and violets. These weren't just a garnish, they were a key part of the salad, adding color and a delicate, sometimes peppery or sweet flavor. The dressing was simple. It was usually a vinaigrette made of oil and vinegar, seasoned with salt and sometimes sugar. The recipe instructs you to wash all the herbs and greens well, pick them over, and dry them. The onions should be sliced very thin, then you arrange everything on a dish. The presentation was important. You might make a pattern with the different colored flowers and herbs. This kind of salat was seen as very healthy. Based on humoral theory, these raw herbs and greens were cold and moist. They were considered a good way to start a meal, especially in the spring and summer, as they were thought to whet the appetite and counteract the hot qualities of the roasted meats that would follow. The writer Andrew Boord, in his A Dietary of Health from 1542, recommended eating salads, but cautioned that the herbs should be young and tender. The inclusion of so many flowers is fascinating. It shows a close connection to the garden and an appreciation for the beauty of ingredients. Many of these flowers also had symbolic meanings. Violets could represent humility, and borage was thought to bring courage. So a salat could be a message as well as a meal. Making a medieval-style salat today is a wonderful experience. Go beyond lettuce. Use a mix of parsley, mint, and spinach. Add some very thinly sliced spring onions. For the dressing, use a simple olive oil and white wine vinegar vinaigrette. And the best part, add some edible flowers. Pansies, nasturtiums, and borage blossoms are easy to find. The result is beautiful to look at and has a complex, fresh flavor that is very different from a standard green salad. But which oil did they use? The recipes just say oil. In England, it might have been rapeseed oil. In France or Italy, olive oil. The type of oil would profoundly impact the taste. And what about the balance of herbs? Was there a classic ratio of parsley to mint? Or was it all up to the cook's whim and the contents of the garden that day? How did they ensure the flowers were clean and free of insects before serving them on the Lord's plate? Number 15 was gingerbread, a house, or a snack. Long before gingerbread houses became a Christmas tradition, gingerbread was a simple, potent, and very popular medieval confection. But it was nothing like the soft cake like gingerbread we know today. It was a hard, dense cake, more like a candy or an energy bar, and it often contained no ginger at all. The name is a bit of a historical mix-up. The Old French term was gingerbread, which was a preserved ginger. This somehow became associated with a sweet cake called gingerbread. Early English recipes for gingerbread are confusing. Some contain ginger, but many do not. The key ingredients were not ginger and molasses, but honey and breadcrumbs. A very common 14th century recipe for gingerbread gives these instructions. Take a quart of honey, clarify it by heating it and skimming off the impurities. And then add a large amount of ground pepper and cinnamon. The recipe also calls for saunders, a red sandalwood powder used purely for coloring to give the cake a deep reddish brown hue. You boil this mixture and then thicken it with breadcrumbs. You need a lot of breadcrumbs, enough to make a very stiff paste. You then press this paste into a wooden mold or simply shape it by hand. The molds were often carved with images of saints, kings, or animals. You would let it set until it was hard. There was no baking involved. The result was a very dense, sweet, and spicy slab. If it had pepper, it would be quite hot. If it was made with cinnamon, it would be warm and aromatic. This gingerbread was sold at fairs and festivals. It was durable and traveled well, making it a perfect snack. Because it was often pressed into molds with images, it was also used as a gift or a party favor. Queen Elizabeth I is famous for having her gingerbread maker create gingerbread men in the likeness of her favorite courtiers. Why breadcrumbs? It was a way to use up stale bread, a common and important practice in a time when no food was wasted. The breadcrumbs also gave the gingerbread its characteristic dense, slightly chewy texture. The honey was both a sweetener and a preservative, allowing the gingerbread to last for a long time. The spices, whether pepper or cinnamon, were there for flavor, but also because they were believed to have medicinal properties. You can make a version of this today. Gently heat some honey in a pan, stir in a good amount of ground cinnamon and a tiny pinch of black pepper. Then, stir in fine, dry breadcrumbs until you have a thick, stiff dough. Press it into a small pan, let it cool completely, and then cut it into squares. It's a strange but compelling taste of the past. It's intensely sweet and spicy. But the name is a puzzle. Why was it called gingerbread if the key ingredient was often pepper or cinnamon? Was inger a generic term for spice at one point? The recipes call for clarified honey. Was this a specialized product or a simple technique every cook knew? And the sandalwood for color national, did it add any flavor, Or was its purpose purely visual, a way to make the humble breadcrumb mixture look more exotic and appealing? Number 14, could you make cheese without a cow? Yes, and it was a crucial ingredient in the medieval kitchen, especially during Lent. The cheese was almond milk, and the curds were a product made from it. Almonds were a cornerstone of high-status medieval cooking. They were versatile, nutritious, and most importantly, they were not an animal product. This meant they could be used on the many fast days when meat and dairy were forbidden. Almond milk was made by taking blanched almonds, grinding them to a fine powder in a mortar, and then steeping them in water or broth. The mixture was then strained through a fine cloth. The resulting liquid was a creamy white milk that could be used in place of cow's milk in almost any recipe. It was used to make pottages creamy, to create delicate sauces, and even to make butter and cheese substitutes. One such dish was called almond curds, or mock cheese. A 15th century recipe explains the process. You start with thick almond milk, you heat it gently in a pot. To this, you add wine or vinegar. The acid causes the almond proteins to curdle, much like how acid curdles dairy milk when making ricotta cheese. You let it stand for a bit, and you will see white curds separate from a watery whey. You then carefully strain these curds through a cloth. You compress them to remove more liquid. The recipe then suggests frying these curds in oil of olive and serving them sprinkled with sugar. The result would be small, tender, slightly savory curds from the almond base, made crispy from frying and then finished with a sweet touch of sugar. It was a sophisticated Lenten dish, a clever way to simulate the texture and richness of dairy cheese without breaking the rules. The use of almonds was a sign of wealth and a connection to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, where almonds were a staple. The great Arab cookbooks of the 10th and 11th centuries, from places like Baghdad, are full of recipes using almonds. Many of these culinary ideas traveled to Europe through Spain and Sicily. The cookbook of Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, Kitab al-Tabik, the Book of Cookery from 10th century Baghdad, is a testament to this sophisticated cuisine that heavily influenced European elite cooking. So, this simple dish of almond curds is part of a huge story of cultural exchange. It connects a fasting English night to the bustling markets of the Islamic Golden Age. But we have some practical questions. Grinding almonds by hand in a mortar is incredibly labor intensive. How long would it take a kitchen servant to produce enough almond milk for a feast? The recipe calls for thick almond milk. What was the ratio of almonds to water to achieve this? And when frying the delicate curds, how did they prevent them from breaking apart or sticking to the pan, especially when cooking over the inconsistent heat of an open fire? Number 13, what was the medieval equivalent of ketchup? While they didn't have tomatoes, medieval cooks did have a go-to condiment that added a savory, complex flavor to many dishes. It wasn't a sauce you'd put on the table, but an ingredient you'd use in cooking. It was called verjuice. Verjuice, or vergis, from the French vergis green juice, was the juice of unripe grapes. In the late summer or early autumn, before the main grape harvest, vintners would thin the vines, removing some of the young, hard green grapes to allow the remaining ones to ripen fully. Instead of throwing these away, they would press them. The resulting juice was incredibly tart and acidic. It was less harsh than vinegar, but had a more complex fruity flavor. Verjuice was a staple in kitchens all over Europe, especially in wine-growing regions like France. It was the primary souring agent in countless recipes, from sauces for fish to stews of beef. Taille-Vence-le-Viandier is filled with recipes that call for verjuice. It was used to deglaze pans, to balance the richness of fatty meats, and to add a bright, fresh note to vegetable dishes. One typical use for it was in a sauce for chicken. A simple 14th century recipe might instruct you to roast a chicken. Then, you take the drippings from the roasting pan. You put the pan over the fire and pour in a good splash of verjuice. As it bubbles, you scrape up all the brown bits from the bottom of the pan. To this, you might add some chopped parsley and a pinch of ginger. You would pour this simple, tangy pan sauce over the carved chicken. This is a classic culinary technique that we still use today. The acidity of the verjuice cuts through the fat of the chicken, and its fruity notes complement the savory flavor of the meat. It's a much more subtle and interesting flavor than you would get from using lemon juice or vinegar. The production of verjuice was a normal part of the agricultural year. The 14th century writer Pietro de Crescenzi, in his work on agriculture, describes the process of making and storing it. It is a way of capturing the flavor of the vineyard and preserving it for use throughout the year. Today, verjuice is making a comeback. Chefs and home cooks are rediscovering its unique flavor. You can buy it in specialty food stores. Try using it instead of lemon juice or white wine in a chicken dish or a salad dressing. It gives a taste that is both ancient and wonderfully new. But what did they do in places that didn't grow grapes like most of England? Did they import verjuice, or did they make a similar product from unripe apples, crab apples, or other sour fruits? The recipes are often from France, but used in England. Was the English cook using the same ingredient as his French counterpart? And how did the flavor of verjuice vary from region to region and from year to year depending on the grape variety and the weather? How sour was sour? Well, number 12. Could a pie be an optical illusion? Yes, in fact, that was often the point. Medieval feasts were not just about eating, they were about entertainment. Illusion foods were a huge part of this. A cook's skill was judged not just on flavor, but on his ability to surprise, delight, and deceive the guests. One of the cleverest examples of this was the two-colored tart. This dish, which appears in various forms in 15th century manuscripts, was a single tart that was half one color and half another. It was a simple trick, but visually very effective on a banquet table filled with many dishes. It showed a high level of technical skill. The recipe is for a sweet custard tart. You would start with a pastry shell, the coffin. Then you would make the custard filling. This was typically made from eggs, cream, or almond milk, and sugar. It was seasoned with spices like nutmeg or mace. Here's the trick. You would divide the custard filling into two separate bowls. In one bowl, you would add a coloring agent to make it yellow. This was usually saffron, the most common and prized food coloring of the time. In the other bowl, you would add a coloring agent to make it green. This was often the juice of spinach or parsley, obtained by pounding the greens in a mortar and squeezing out the liquid through a cloth. Now you had two bowls of custard, one yellow and one green. The challenge was to get them into the same pie shell without them mixing. The cook would insert a thin piece of wood or metal down the center of the pastry case, creating a divider. He would then carefully pour the yellow custard into one half and the green custard into the other. Then, very carefully, he would pull the divider straight up and out. If done correctly, the two thick custards would sit side by side with a clean line between them. The tart was then baked in an oven. The result was a single beautiful pie, half brilliant gold and half deep green. It was a simple but magical effect. The flavor would be that of a classic sweet custard tart, but the visual impact was everything. This kind of playful deception was part of a tradition of sautelts, or subtleties. As food historian C.M. Woolgar notes in his works on the medieval senses, a feast was a multi-sensory experience. The sight of the food was just as important as the taste. A two-colored tart was a feast for the eyes before it was a feast for the stomach. But how did they ensure the two custards had the exact same consistency so that one didn't run into the other when the divider was removed? Baking it in a medieval oven with uneven heat must have been a nightmare. How did they prevent one side from browning more than the other, ruining the color effect? And were there other color combinations? Could you make a red and white tart, perhaps using sandalwood for red and just the plain custard for white? Was this a common trick, or the secret of a few highly skilled master cooks? In number 11, did they have meatballs? Yes, they did, but they were often much more complex and surprising than the simple Italian-American meatball we know today. Medieval cooks loved to grind, mix, and reshape ingredients. A fantastic example of this are pomme d'oras, which translates to golden apples. These were meatballs designed to look like golden fruit. The recipe is found in several English manuscripts from around the 14th and 15th centuries. They were a popular and visually striking dish for a feast. The recipe starts with meat. It could be pork or beef or a mixture. The meat was not coarsely ground like modern minced meat. It was pounded in a mortar or very finely chopped until it was a paste. This paste was then mixed with suet beef fat for richness and moisture. To this meat base, you would add a variety of spices. Saffron was common for color and flavor. So were cloves, mace, and powder forte, a strong spice blend, heavy on pepper. The mixture was then bound together with raw egg yolks. You would roll this paste into perfectly round balls, the size of a small apple. These meatballs were then parboiled or partly roasted to cook them through. Then came the gilding process that gave them their name. You would make a thin batter, similar to the one used for gilded chicken. It was made of flour, or sometimes egg yolks, mixed with a large amount of saffron to get a brilliant yellow gold color. Each meatball was then put on a skewer, dipped in this batter, and roast it over the fire just long enough for the batter to cook and form a golden shell around the meatball. Some very luxurious versions were even covered in gold leaf. They were served on a platter, looking like a pile of golden apples. When a guest bit into one, they would get the surprise of the rich, spicy meat inside. The flavor would be savory and aromatic, with the richness of the meat and suet balanced by the warm spices. This dish is a perfect example of the medieval love of transformation. It takes a humble ingredient like ground meat and elevates it into something artistic and surprising. According to historian Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton in her book, Savoring the Past, this kind of playful presentation was a hallmark of French and English courtly cuisine. It was all about creating a spectacle. But how did they get the meatballs perfectly spherical without modern tools? When they dipped the meatballs in the batter, how did they get a smooth, even coating? Roasting them on a skewer after battering seems incredibly tricky. How did they prevent the batter from dripping off or burning before the meatball was heated through? And what was the ideal spice blend? Did a cook's reputation rest on his secret recipe for pomme d'ores? Number 10, cuisine flour. We've already seen flours used as a colorful ingredient in salads, but could a flour be the main event? Yes, one popular recipe from the 15th century was for primrose pottage. This was a sweet custard-like dish made with primrose flowers. It was served as a dessert or a special dish in the spring when primroses were in bloom. It's a beautiful example of how medieval people used seasonal, foraged ingredients in their cooking. The recipe is quite simple. You take a great quantity of primrose flowers, you wash them and grind them in a mortar. Some recipes say to grind them with almonds or rice flour to create a thicker base. This flour paste is then mixed with milk or almond milk and sweetened with honey or sugar. You would then gently heat this mixture in a pot, stirring it until it thickens into a pottage or a custard. Saffron was often added to enhance the yellow color of the primroses. Some versions were thickened with egg yolks, making them richer. The finished pottage was poured into bowls and sometimes garnished with whole primrose flowers. The taste would be delicate and floral. Primroses have a faint, sweet, and slightly peppery flavor. And combined with the creamy base of almond milk and the sweetness of honey, it would have been a light and fragrant dessert. It's a world away from the heavy, spicy meat dishes we often associate with the period. This recipe shows an intimate knowledge of the natural world. People knew which wild plants were edible and when to harvest them. The book, The Medieval Flower Book by Celia Fisher, shows how flowers were deeply embedded in the culture, art, and symbolism of the period. Cooking with them was a natural extension of this. Primroses were associated with youth and springtime, so a dish made from them was a celebration of the changing seasons. It's a dish you could still make today, provided you have a source of primroses that haven't been treated with pesticides. It's a reminder that not all medieval food was brown and heavy. It could be colorful, delicate, and deeply connected to the landscape. But how many primroses would you need to make a pottage for a whole household? The quantity must have been huge. Grinding delicate flower petals in a mortar seems like a difficult task. How did they get a smooth paste rather than a bruised mess? And were there other flower pottages? The recipes mention primroses and sometimes violets. Did they ever make a pottage of rose petals or marigolds? What other forgotten floral flavors did they enjoy? Number 9. How did they preserve fruit without a freezer? Before modern canning and freezing, preserving the harvest to last through the long winter was a critical skill. One of the most delicious ways they preserved fruit was by making a type of fruit paste or leather called a quince cheese or membrillo. This recipe was especially popular in southern Europe, where quinces grow well, but it was known in England too. A quince is a hard acidic and astringent fruit. When raw, it looks like a lumpy apple or pear. But when you cook it for a long time, it undergoes a magical transformation. Its flesh turns from white to a beautiful deep pink or ruby red, and its flavor becomes rich, floral, and delicious. The recipe for quince cheese is ancient, likely dating back to the Romans who would cook quince with honey. The medieval version, found in many household recipe books, involves peeling and coring the quinces, then boiling them in water until they are very soft. The cooked fruit is then pushed through a sieve to create a smooth puree. This puree is then put in a pot with a large amount of sugar or honey, usually an equal weight to the fruit puree. This mixture is then cooked slowly for a very long time, stirring constantly. As it cooks, the water evaporates and the mixture becomes very thick and darkens in color. The pectin in the quince, combined with the sugar, causes it to set. When it's so thick that a spoon drawn through it leaves a clear trail, it's ready. You pour the hot paste into shallow, oiled molds or trays and leave it to cool and set. The result is a solid, sliceable block of fruit paste. It has an intensely sweet and aromatic quince flavor. It can be stored for many months, even years, in a cool, dry place. Quince cheese was served as a dessert, often with actual cheese. The sweet, fragrant fruit paste is a perfect complement to a sharp, salty cheese. This is a food pairing, membrillo con manchego, that is still a classic in Spain today. It was also considered a digestive aid, just like ginger candy. The 12th century physician and scholar Moses Maimonides, who worked in Spain and Egypt, wrote about the health benefits of fruit preserves. This idea of food as both pleasure and medicine was central to medieval thought. Quince cheese was the perfect embodiment of this, a delicious treat that was also good for you. But the cooking process is very long. How did a medieval cook manage a pot that needed constant stirring for hours over a wood fire? And how did they judge when the mixture was ready without a sugar thermometer? The recipes say to cook it until it is hard. This is a very subjective measure. Did batches often fail, either by being too soft or by being scorched on the bottom of the pot? And did they make similar cheeses with other fruits like apples or pears? Number 8. Could fish be a pie? Yes, of course. Pies were one of the great staples of medieval cooking. They were a convenient way to cook, and serve a filling in the pastry case helped to keep the contents moist. While we are familiar with meat pies, fish pies were also extremely common, especially for the many fast days. A great example is a salmon and fig pie. This might sound like a very strange combination to us. Sweet fruit with savory fish, but in medieval cuisine, this was completely normal. The line between sweet and savory was very blurry. This recipe, found in 15th century English collections, shows this principle in action. The recipe starts with a pastry coffin. Inside, you would place a piece of fresh salmon. On top of the salmon, you would put a layer of figs and raisins. You would then add a pickling spice mixture. This included salt, pepper, and sometimes powder forte. Some versions call for adding a liquid like ale or wine to the pie before sealing it. The pie would be sealed with a pastry lid and baked. As it cooked, the juices from the salmon would mingle with the sweetness of the dried fruit and the sharpness of the spices. The figs and raisins would soften and create a kind of sweet and savory sauce for the fish. The result would be a pie with a complex flavor profile. You'd have the rich, oily flavor of the salmon, the intense sweetness of the figs and raisins, and the warm kick of the spices. It's a combination that challenges our modern taste categories, but it works. The sweetness cuts through the richness of the fish in a pleasant way. Think of it like a sweet chutney served with a piece of smoked mackerel. This mixing of fruit and meat or fish is a hallmark of medieval cooking and has its roots in Persian and Arab cuisine. The book, a Baghdad cookery book, a translation of the 10th century Kitab al-Tabish, is filled with recipes for stews, tagines, that combine meat like lamb with fruits like apricots and dates. These culinary ideas traveled to Europe and heavily influenced the food of the wealthy. A salmon and fig pie is a distant English cousin of a rich Persian stew, but what kind of figs did they use? Were they the dark sweet figs we know, or a different variety? The recipe is for salmon. This was a prized but common fish in medieval England. Would the recipe work as well with other fish like cod or pike? And how did they prevent the pastry from becoming soggy from all the liquid inside, a problem that still plagues modern pie makers? Was a soggy bottom a concern for the medieval cook? Number 7, was there a medieval superfood? While the term superfood is a modern marketing invention, there were certainly ingredients that medieval people prized for their health-giving properties. One of the most important of these was the herb sage. It was used in countless dishes, not just for its strong aromatic flavor, but because it was believed to be incredibly good for you. A great example of this is a simple dish called sage fritters. There was a Latin proverb popular in the Middle Ages, cur moriatur homo qui salvia crescit in horto. It means, why should a man die who has sage growing in his garden? Sage was thought to strengthen the memory, comfort the nerves, and protect against the plague. It was a medicinal powerhouse that grew in almost every garden. The recipe for sage fritters is wonderfully simple. It's found in English cookbooks from the 15th century. You take large, fresh sage leaves. You make a simple batter from flour, ale, and egg yolks. You dip the sage leaves into the batter, one by one, holding them by the stem. Then you fry them in hot oil or lard until the batter is golden and crisp. The recipe says to serve them sprinkled with sugar. The result is a delicious and surprising snack. You get the crispy, savory batter, the strong, pungent flavor of the sage leaf inside, and then a sweet finish from the sugar. It's a combination of savory, herbal, and sweet, all in one bite. This is a dish that could be made by almost anyone. Sage was easy to grow. Flour, ale, and eggs were staples. The only luxury ingredient was the sugar, and even that could be replaced with a drizzle of honey or omitted entirely. It was a quick, tasty way to use a common garden herb. The great 14th century household guide Les Ménagères de Paris, written by an anonymous older man for his young wife, is full of practical advice and recipes. It includes instructions for making similar herb fritters, showing that this was a common dish in a well-run household. It was part of the everyday food landscape, not just for feasts, but the recipes are vague on the details. How thick should the batter be? What kind of oil was best for frying? Lard would give a different flavor than rapeseed oil. And why sprinkle them with sugar? Was it purely for taste, or was there a humoral reason, with the sweetness balancing the hot properties of the fried food and the warm properties of the sage? Did they make fritters from other herbs like mint or parsley? Number 6. How did you cook a vegetable for 6 hours? In our world of quick stir fries and flash steamed vegetables, the idea of cooking a vegetable for hours seems strange. But medieval cooks had different goals. One of the most unusual and delicious vegetable recipes was for rapes and pottage, which involved slowly cooking turnips until they were transformed into something completely new. Rapes is the old word for turnips. This recipe from a 15th century manuscript shows the medieval technique of slow cooking and flavor concentration. It's a method for taking a humble watery root vegetable and making it rich and savory. The recipe instructs you to peel the turnips and parboil them. Then you press out as much water as you can. This is a key step as it begins the process of concentrating the flavor. The pressed turnips are then mashed or hewn small. You then put the mashed turnips in a pot with good broth, likely a rich beef or pork stock. You let this simmer for a long time. The recipe says for 2 or 3 hours, and some variations imply even longer. As it simmers, the turnips absorb the flavor of the broth, and their own flavor deepens and sweetens. Towards the end of the cooking, you add saffron to give it a beautiful golden color. You also add powder douce for a sweet spicy note. The final dish is a thick, savory, and slightly sweet puree of turnips. It would have a deep earthy flavor from the turnips enriched by the meat broth and warmed by the spices. It would be served as a side dish, a medieval equivalent of mashed potatoes. This long cooking process breaks down the vegetable structure and caramelizes its natural sugars, creating a depth of flavor you can't get from quick cooking. This principle was understood by cooks like the one who wrote the recipes in the collection known as the Goude Coquerie. These recipes show a real understanding of how to build flavor through technique, not just by adding spices. But how did they manage this long, slow simmer over an open fire without it catching and burning on the bottom of the pot? This constant stirring would be needed. And the instruction to press the turnips, how was this done effectively? Did they use a linen cloth or a dedicated press? The flavor of the final dish would depend almost entirely on the quality of the good broth. What was the secret to making a truly rich and flavorful medieval stock? Number 5. Could a pudding be boiled in a bag? Yes. In fact, for centuries, that was the primary way of making a pudding. Before the invention of modern ovens and pudding basins, the easiest way to cook a liquid-based pudding was to put it in a cloth bag or an animal's stomach and boil it. This is the ancestor of the classic English boiled pudding, like a Christmas pudding or a steak and kidney pudding. A great medieval example is white pudding in a gut. This was a type of sausage, but not the kind we usually think of. It was a pudding, in the British sense, a savory dish cooked in a casing. It's related to modern white pudding, which is still popular in Ireland and Scotland. The recipe from the 15th century starts with a filling. It's not based on blood, like a black pudding. Instead, the base is breadcrumbs, cream, and egg yolks. To this, you add a large amount of chopped suet, which is the hard fat from around the kidneys of a cow or sheep. The suet provides richness and flavor. The mixture is seasoned, but not with the usual medieval spices. Instead, the recipe calls for saffron for color and a large amount of salt. The whole mixture is then stuffed into a clean intestine or a gut, usually from a pig. The ends are tied securely. This long sausage is then carefully placed in a pot of boiling water and cooked for a long time. The boiling cooks the filling, and the casing holds it all together. After boiling, it can be eaten as is, or it can be cooled and then sliced and fried in butter until golden brown. The taste and texture are rich and savory. It's soft, almost creamy, from the bread and cream, with a deep flavor from the suet. For frying, it adds a wonderful crispy crust. It was a hearty, fatty, and very satisfying food, perfect for a cold day. It was a way of using up perishable ingredients like cream and suet and preserving them in a convenient form. The practice of making sausages and puddings is ancient. The Roman cookbook Apicius contains recipes for similar dishes. It's a fundamental part of culinary history, born from the desire to use every part of the animal and to preserve meat and fat. The medieval white pudding is a direct descendant of this tradition, but cleaning the intestines for the casing is a difficult and unpleasant job. Was this a specialized task done by the butcher or part of the daily work of the kitchen staff? How did they fill the casings without modern sausage stuffing equipment? And how did they know when the pudding was cooked through to the center without a thermometer? An undercooked pudding would be unpleasant, but an overcooked one might burst in the pot. Number 4, what did you eat when you were rich and bored? When you had tried every spice and seen every kind of gilded bird, you needed something truly new and exotic to impress your guests. For the medieval super rich, this sometimes meant eating a porpoise, or more accurately, a thick porridge made from it called porpoise and pottage. Porpoises, along with whales and seals, were considered fish by the medieval church. This was a convenient classification as it meant these sea mammals could be eaten during Lent and on other fast days. For a wealthy household, looking for an impressive and unusual centerpiece for a Lenten feast, a porpoise was a perfect choice. Catching and transporting a porpoise was a major undertaking, so it was an automatic status symbol. The recipes for cooking it, found in high-status cookbooks like the Form of Curie, reflect its special nature. A typical recipe for porpoise pottage is very rich. You would take the porpoise meat and boil it in a mixture of wine and water. Then you would chop it into small pieces. You would make a thick pottage base using breadcrumbs soaked in the winey broth and ground almonds to make it creamy. The porpoise meat was added to this. The pottage was then heavily spiced and seasoned. It was sweetened with sugar, made sour with vinegar, and spiced with a mix of ginger, cloves, and cinnamon. Saffron was added to give it a rich golden color. The final dish was a thick, sweet, sour, and spicy stew of porpoise meat. It would be served in bowls, often with a sprinkle of whole cloves or a drizzle of honey on top. What did it taste like? Porpoise meat is very dark, rich, and oily, with a strong, gamey, and distinctly fishy flavor. It's not like any meat we commonly eat today. The powerful, sweet, and sour sauce was absolutely necessary to balance and mask the strong flavor of the meat. It would have been an intense and very unusual dish, a true acquired taste. King Henry VIII's court records show large payments for porpoises, indicating they were a regular feature at royal feasts. The great London trade companies, like the Fishmongers' Company, regulated the sale of porpoise in the city markets. It was a known if rare commodity, but we have so many unanswered questions. How did they butcher such a large and unusual animal? Was there a specific technique? The recipes call for porpoise, but were they also eating other small cetaceans like dolphins? And most importantly, what possessed them to think this was a good idea? Was the appeal purely the novelty and status? Or did some people genuinely love the taste of sweet and sour porpoise stew? Number 3, was toast always a side dish? No. In the Middle Ages, toast was often the main event. It wasn't just a piece of dry bread. It was a vehicle for rich, savory toppings, a bit like a medieval bruschetta or an open-faced sandwich. One of the most popular of these dishes was called poor knight's pudding, the direct ancestor of what we now call French toast. The name is thought to be ironic. It was a dish that used a stale, humble ingredient old bread and transformed it into something rich and delicious enough for a knight. It was a clever way to make sure no food went to waste. The recipe, found in various forms across Europe from the 14th century onwards, is simple. You take slices of stale white bread, you make a batter of eggs and milk or cream. You dip the bread into this batter, letting it soak up the rich mixture. Then you fry the soaked bread in butter or lard until it is golden brown and crispy on the outside and soft and custardy on the inside. The finished toasts were then served with a sweet topping. This could be a simple sprinkle of sugar, a drizzle of honey, or a dusting of cinnamon. Sometimes they were served with a sweet wine sauce or a fruit compote. This dish was known by many names. In Germany, it was Army Ritter Poor Knights. In France, it was payn perdu, lost bread, a name that beautifully captures the idea of rescuing stale bread from being thrown away. The English recipe in the form of curry calls it payn fondue or melted bread. It's a perfect example of frugal cooking elevated to something special. In a world where bread was the staff of life, throwing it away was a sin. This recipe redeems it. It's also a reminder that many of our classic dishes have incredibly long histories. The French toast you might eat for brunch on a Sunday has a pedigree that goes back over 600 years. But what kind of bread did they use? Medieval white bread or payn was finer and denser than our modern sandwich loaves. How did this affect the final texture? The recipe calls for frying in butter. The flavor of medieval butter, unpasteurized and churned by hand, would have been much stronger and more variable than ours. How much did that flavor contribute to the dish? And was this really a dish for poor knights, or was it a comforting nursery food served in wealthy households, with the name being just a charming fiction? Number 2, cuisine. This is one of the most famous and bizarre ideas from medieval cuisine. The nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," describes a pie with 24 blackbirds that begin to sing when the pie was opened. Was this just a fantasy, or did they really put live birds in a pie? The answer is yes, they did. It was a type of subtlety or illusion food designed to create a moment of shock and wonder at a feast. It wasn't a pie to be eaten, but a piece of culinary theater. The trick is explained in a recipe from the 16th century, but the practice is older. You would first bake a very large, deep pie crust with a lid. This was the coffin. It would be baked empty, or with a temporary filling to support the structure, which was later removed. The crust had to be very thick and strong. Separately, you would make a normal edible bird pie, perhaps with pigeons or other small birds. At the feast, the great empty pie crust would be brought to the table. Just before serving, a number of live birds, blackbirds, sparrows, or other small birds would be placed inside the hollow crust. The lid would be put on top. When the host cut into the pie, the birds, startled by the light and noise, would fly out, creating a chaotic and spectacular moment for the assembled guests. The real edible bird pie would then be served. Sometimes other animals were used. There are accounts of pies filled with live frogs, which would hop all over the table. This was the ultimate party trick. It comes from a 1573 book called Epilario, or the Italian Banquet. The author describes it as a way to make the guests merry. It wasn't about cruelty in the way we'd see it today. It was about creating a moment of wonder, blurring the lines between the living and the dead, the raw and the cooked. That was so central to the medieval feast aesthetic. It was a performance. The personal chef to Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy in the mid-15th century was famous for his incredible feast displays. At one feast in 1454, the Feast of the Pheasant, he presented a pie from which 24 musicians emerged, playing their instruments. While perhaps an exaggeration, it shows the ambition and theatricality of these events. The singing bird pie was part of this grand tradition, but how did they keep the birds calm and quiet inside the pie before it was cut? And how did they prevent the birds from, well, making a mess inside the pie crust? What was the reaction of the guests? Was it delight, or did some people find it alarming to have a flock of birds suddenly flying around the Great Hall? And did this trick ever go wrong? Did the birds sometimes fail to fly out, leading to an awkward silence? And number 1, could you sew a rooster to a pig? This is perhaps the most bizarre, ambitious, and frankly unsettling dish in the entire medieval culinary repertoire. It was the absolute pinnacle of the subtlety. It was called the cockatrice. A cockatrice was a creature of pure culinary fantasy. It was made by taking the front half of a piglet and the back half of a large chicken, or capon, and sewing them together. The resulting hybrid animal was then stuffed, roasted, and presented at the feast as if it were a real, newly discovered beast. The recipe appears in a 15th century English manuscript. The instructions are disturbingly precise. You take a fattened capon, you scald it and draw it. You take a young pig, scald it, and cut it in half at the waist. You take the hind part of the capon and the fore part of the pig and sew them together. You use a needle and strong thread. Some recipes suggest using a skewer to hold the two halves together firmly. You can also do the reverse, the front of the capon and the back of the pig. The head of the piglet was often left on, and the head of the rooster. Once the creature was assembled, it was stuffed with a rich forcemeat, often containing breadcrumbs, eggs, suet, and spices. It was then parboiled. After parboiling, it was covered in a batter of egg yolks and saffron, or gilded with gold leaf, and then roasted on a spit. It was often presented sitting up, sometimes with a miniature helmet and lance, as if it were a knight ready for a joust. This was not a dish about flavor. The pork and chicken would cook at different rates, making it very difficult to get right. The pork would likely be cooked long before the chicken. It was purely about the visual spectacle. It was the ultimate expression of the cook's art, and the host's power. It showed that he could not only afford expensive ingredients, but could afford to manipulate nature itself to create new life on the dinner plate. This desire to create mythical beasts for the table was the height of feast culture. As described by historians like Rie Tannehill in Food and History, the medieval feast was a piece of propaganda. A dish, like the cockentrice, was a statement. It said the host was so wealthy and powerful, he could bend the rules of God's creation for the amusement of his guests. But the practicalities are mind-boggling. How did they sew the two animals together so that the seam was strong enough to hold during roasting? How did they mount this strangely shaped creature on a spit? And when it was brought to the table, was it ever actually carved and eaten? Or was it, like the bird pie, purely a showpiece to be admired and then taken away, with more conventionally cooked meat served in its place? What must it have been like to be a guest at a feast and to see this golden two-headed monster being carried into the hall? It's a question that takes us to the very heart of the strange and wonderful world of medieval food. It was a world of flavor, of art, of faith, and of power, all cooked together in a single pot.